So please give a very warm welcome now to Ryan Gariepy.
All right, so I'm going to talk about completely automating the world after we can't get polling software to work. That's be a great start. I did notice, incidentally, in the crowd that there's a lot of people from RBC here. Just so you know, I'm already a client, so we'll just get that out on the table. I'm here to talk about why self-driving cars will not save the world. I know this is a controversial thing to discuss, especially after you look at all of this news, that if you look at the news, if you read the news, self-driving cars are the next big thing, possibly the only big thing in robotics. And I don't really believe that that's the case. I believe there's a lot better ways that we could spend our resources and our time and our experience than to focus on taking the human completely out of the car. Now, that's not to say that cars are not unsafe. They are unsafe. It's not to say that I don't like the concept of a self-driving car. I'll be the first to sign up for a true self-driving car. But I think there's other ways to go about taking robotics and autonomous systems into the field and making a real difference than to drop it into arguably one of the more difficult and complex and challenging areas in our society to navigate, and that's both figuratively and literally. I will also, I'll just say as well for forewarning, this presentation is likely to bring up some interesting conversations about the future of work in general. And I will be happy, of course, to take your questions and then immediately redirect them to the future of work speaker tomorrow. I believe that's Gary. So just to put that out there. So self-driving cars, like what is the value here? Is this really a harsh job? Is that a harsh job? I mean, you're already in the car, so it frees you up to what? Read in the car, to have some coffee in the car, to check your email in the car. Is that really harsh? The position I take is not really. I mean, forestry is a harsh job. Construction, all weather, is a harsh job. There's probably construction workers working outside right now. That's a harsh job. Manufacturing, very harsh job, very necessary to Canada's economy in particular. Farming, also harsh job. You can kind of see where I'm going with this. It's like not the car thing, it's everything else. We have climate change, obviously. There's resisting the impacts of climate change. How hard did BC and Alberta get hit with the forest fires? Like, what kind of people were put in harm's way? Or what sort of experience did they have? Like, that's a harsh job. And then getting us the resources we need. These are all very, very harsh jobs. And in the country where this actual picture was taken, 1 in 7 members of that country, 1 in 7 members of that country's workforce work on a daily basis just on jobs like that to provide for their family. I mean, you can see where I'm going. That is Canada. That 1 in 7 Canadians do backbreaking labor on a daily basis to provide for their families. Like 1 in 7 Canadians in the workforce do backbreaking labor. And this is one of the most developed nations in the world. And this isn't a matter of choice for many people. It's their only option, really. Let's extend that to the rest of the world. In the spirit of singularity and impacting a billion people's lives, there's actually about 1 billion people who do that sort of work, and that's what they're tied to. It's 1 billion people. I'm actually going to simplify the statistics because I am a bit fundamentally lazy on some of these things, so I broke it down to the OECD because the OECD makes statistics easier to get. So if we look at just the OECD, where there's about 1.3 billion people makes up the OECD, that it's about 160 million workers just do these prototypically called dull, dirty, dangerous jobs on a regular basis. That's what they do. And that's really, from where I stand, that's wasted potential. We have 160 million workers moving boxes around, cutting trees down, mining. Like it's very basic work. It's harsh work and it's wasted potential. And they're doing this. We as a society are choosing to have members of our society doing this. Well, we have failing infrastructure. Well, we have natural disasters. Well, we have pollution, climate change, rising ocean levels, like all of these things. We have 160 million people doing things that they don't need to be doing, and at the same time, we're being faced with this most significant challenges probably global society has ever seen. So really, what do we do about that? Okay, so I think I've finished being depressing. No guarantees, but pretty sure I've finished being depressing for this talk. So let's talk about what we can do about it. And it turns out, as everyone should know, that since hundreds and hundreds of years ago, we have had this ability to convert energy from one form into another. And now we're into robotics. We can turn energy from one form into another. We can do manual labor without having a person lift a finger. So if you take those 180 million workers, and fortunately, robots are not yet unionized until Suzanne has her way. She's up next. We have 60 million robots because they don't take breaks. So now you have 60 million robots at about $10,000 a year. You can ask me about this math later, but there's your acquisition cost or acquisition and maintenance cost of about $10,000 per year. That's about $600 billion per year. So $600 billion per year spent. You have completely removed all manual labor in the OECD. And now you have 180 million people who are free to do, we'll just say, more fulfilling things. That's a lot, right? That's 6 times the population of Canada, everyone who can work on literally changing the world. And to put it in perspective, this is the OECD GDP, and of which you see about just over 1% is already put into total unemployment, so unemployment support and labor support. So we're actually already spending this, and that robot cost winds up to about 1% of the OECD GDP. So we're talking like fractional percents here of completely rethinking how the world can operate. And I hope if there are any economists in the room, I know I've met some, please hold your criticism until after. So let's get to the robots. We said that we have a problem. The cost of implementation is not actually that hard. The challenge is, how do you actually build this technology? How do you go from the failing polling systems to supporting these jobs? I'm probably not going to let that one rest. The position I take is that you should actually think about the problems you're solving and try to do it in some sort of reasonable order, which takes into account the similarities between these problems and their challenges. So starting with manufacturing, going to mining, going to goods transport, going to farming, and then going to construction. And I'll go through why I propose this particular stage of investment and development. First, because really all of these problems are variations on one theme. You're just moving stuff around. Everything from just assembling of iPhones to hard rock mining is just moving pieces of matter from one location to another. If you want to talk about fundamentals, that's really what's going on. You're removing rock from the ground. You're removing plants from the ground. You are transporting goods inside a factory. You're transporting goods between factories. You are putting cars together. You're putting houses together. It's all very similar and very, very, very related. So that means that if you can start with the fundamentals, then it all really becomes the same problem in the end. So the first step, autonomous manufacturing. I really focus on this as the first step because of these features which I've put up here. It's a climate-controlled environment. It's a structured environment. The environment runs at relatively low speeds. There are trained personnel who are constantly working in this environment. There are defined interactions that happen. Everyone knows what interactions are happening on a regular basis. And the tasks are very ordered. It's a very simple place. And I mean, yes, those are, or 2 of 3 of those are robots. And the reason for that is because we went through this thought exercise as we were deciding to go further and commercialize our systems and said that this is the place where we wanted to start. So if I'm wrong about this, then I think we've bet like $40 million of other people's money. So I guess I've got a bigger bet than anyone else in this room on this particular one. But I'm still feeling pretty strongly about this one. And then I do think we're already seeing significant adoption within the industries. It's not just a science fair project anymore. We are seeing companies now really jump on to this concept of indoor self-driving vehicles and really expand with it. So we're generally predicting that there will be measurable economic impact, not just it's on the road and there's press written about it, but there will be measurable economic impact within 5 years with this technology. Next up, we have autonomous mining. These are also already in various sorts of deployments. There's a heavy amount of autonomous mining deployment in Australia, for instance. But there still is, there's a lot more to go. And the reason I say this is next is there's still some similarities here. You've still got very trained personnel. You don't have random people walking into a mine, for example. The interactions are still very defined. It's very much a concept of pick up rock and put rock in another place. And the tasks are also, again, very ordered, that you don't unmine a mine once it's already been done. But things are getting a little bit harder. The conditions that we operate in mining is much harsher. If any of you have been in mine, have any of you been in a mine? Just raise your hand. Okay, actually a surprising amount of people. It's a fun place, right? It's exactly where you want to spend 40 years of your life. And so we start with, we do have harsh conditions. The environment is a lot less structured. You're seeing tree line on the left. There's basically more hills on the right, much less defined than a factory. And your speeds are starting to speed up. You're no longer running at 10 or 20 kilometers an hour. You're running at sometimes 50 or 60 kilometers an hour. So it is getting more challenging, but it is a step beyond, or it's a step from here. You're not taking a large leap. Then from there, my completely unqualified projection is measurable economic impact within 10 years. I say this because about 5 or 10 years ago, we were seeing demonstrations that pretty much everything you can do in a mine is something which can be automated. So now we're talking about the nuances of rolling it out. For example, the middle video you see of completely autonomous loading and dumping, that video was from 5-ish years ago. So there's still a lot of near-term potential here on this measurable economic impact. Now, beyond this, we get into a little bit more unknowns, but because I'm up here already, I'm just going to keep putting years to it, and you can come find me in a few decades if I'm wrong. So here's autonomous transport. This is very much the sibling of self-driving passenger cars. Here, you're speeding up. You're still in harsh conditions. You've got your unstructured environment. Fortunately, you still have ordered tasks to work with. You tend to know exactly what you're doing in what order, and it doesn't change that quickly. But now you've got untrained personnel and undefined interactions. And what I mean here is that you've basically got to deal with the real world. In mining, it's still a very contained environment where you control who goes in and who goes out. And you can control what sort of information they get and what sort of protective equipment they have before they start interacting with your machines. Once you're in autonomous transport, you don't have that anymore. You've got to deal with the public. For anyone who's done any sort of risk analysis whatsoever, the public is not a really good place when it comes down to analyzing the risks around your system. But fortunately, all of these other challenges, how do you deal with the snow, how do you deal with the environments, how do you deal with high speeds, if we do it in this particular order, all of those challenges are now a non-issue. Right now, you're having people who they're deploying self-driving cars, but they don't really know how they're handling them in the rain. They don't really know what to do with it. They don't know what to do with any Canadian weather whatsoever, generally. And they don't know how to control this at speed safely and reliably. So they're solving those problems at the same time as they're trying to solve the problems of how do you deploy this technology safely around everybody. They're trying to solve everything at once. It's just a fundamentally inefficient way of doing things. Inefficient use of time, inefficient use of capital. 15 years is what I'm saying on this. I know Elon Musk says, 6 months definitely, 3 months maybe, or whatever his statement is. But, I mean, you've got great videos up here, and it's possible to run these on the road. But as anyone who's gone and taken this technology into deployment knows, it's about what happens when you run it on the road for 10 million hours, or how you service it, or how you train. There's a lot of unknown questions that these companies are only now starting to tackle. And I think it's going to take a while until they tackle them, and yet a while further until we have significant adoption within all of our roadways. And to say nothing about the regulatory challenges which start to emerge once you go on-road with these. Autonomous farming. This one's next. So everything's the same as before, but now you've got undefined interactions. It's still challenging to handle food, to understand if food is ripe, if it's ready. There's still a great deal of challenge of doing this at scale and doing it easily and doing it so that a farmer can really handle this, or a farmer can maintain this technology as opposed to a PhD. Fortunately, we are seeing, actually, that's a startup on the right, which is focusing on indoor high-density greenleaf plants. And then on the left side, you have automated pollination and automated plant monitoring, which is kind of a precursor to this, understanding what plants are like. You can start to then move beyond that to grasping and manipulation and actually the harvesting part. And then in the middle, there is some research that's from QUT in Australia on automated harvesting. So there is a lot of work to be done here that remains, but there is still great progress which has been happening. And I think to really extract the rest of people, not just from crops like wheat, but through the entire variety of food that we eat, there's a lot. There's a lot more work that still has to be done. So I'm going to put up 25 years for this one. Of course, this could entirely be shortcutted if all of our food just becomes completely digitized and 3D printed, in which case then we don't actually need any of that. But I'm just going to take the robot side on this one. And my last step here is autonomous construction. You'll notice that I avoided putting up a Boston Dynamics robot because I think they get a bit too much press, so I wanted to level the playing field a little bit. So instead, the walking robot here on the right is from AIST. Could you raise your hand if you've hung drywall before? Everyone's hung drywall before. Okay, so you would probably want this one on the right then, hanging drywall. Very slowly hanging drywall, but these things do tend to speed up. So we're seeing now on the left side, this is a startup out of California, Built Robotics, which is doing autonomous site preparation. So they're starting to look at some very initial areas where they can do some automated grading. There's nobody in that cab. They're of course painting an idyllic world where the father and his daughter sit down and have some lunch while the dozer does its work, which is really cool. But there's the start, right? Like this is the start of this technology. Now, fortunately, look, it's all in a conveniently open space and there's nobody actually around it who could possibly get in the way of this autonomous system, but it is a start. And from here, we can build on things. And as I said before, you've got everything. Once you've solved those other problems, you now have systems that need to operate in harsh conditions, in unstructured environment, with untrained personnel, at high speeds, with undefined interactions, and then finally what I would call unordered collaborative tasks. So this is because when you do construction or any sort of work like that, you're probably interacting with someone in a very, very hands-on way. You're carrying the drywall down the stairs 2 at a time, for instance, or you're helping guide a piece of framing into place. Like there's a very, very clear handshake between people, and it takes a great deal of further experience in human-robot interactions and safety to be able to handle that in a very clean way. But I do think that the time is coming on this. We're seeing, how do I start these videos again? We're seeing some very clear progress which is being done here. So I'm saying 35 years on this one. And by the time you have measurable economic impact within 35 years, you're basically at the point where you are applying funding and resources, or by the end it would be just energy and resources, and you're building buildings from that. That's 35 years sounds like a long time, but if you look at the possibility of what can be done here, it really does tend to upend everything. If you look at this from an infrastructure maintenance perspective, when you've done everything that leads up to this, it comes down to what society as a whole wants to do with our resources. When you have the ability to apply arbitrary amounts of autonomous systems working 24/7 in all weather conditions to, for instance, build a bridge or actually build the freight bag pass by the 401, which I would be a fan of. But there's a great deal of potential once we get all of this done. And really, it starts by starting at the easiest tasks, proving that out, freeing those people from having to work on those tasks, helping redirect both those people and the technological foundation that you've built onto the next tasks and the other similar challenges facing society, and repeat. And here's where we get into that exponential concept is manufacturing, for example. There's about 2 million people, I think, in Canada doing manufacturing or involved in the manufacturing sector. Let's call it about 1 million of that doing the labor aspect of that. What could Canada do with another million workers? Like, what could we accomplish? I bet it's a lot. So it makes work a lot more pleasant. You're not working these dirty jobs anymore. Your work is pleasant. We've unlocked more potential and more capability to build a safer and cleaner world. The jobs which remain will be more human. There will be more human jobs. These jobs aren't going to be automated anytime soon. So instead of taking time or having to take that factory job because it's necessary for society that we put people in factory jobs, you have people who are able to spend more time interacting with other people or spending more time with their families. Again, I'm saying very controversial things, and I'll defer it to the future of work speaker tomorrow. And more fulfilling jobs at the same time. How many people really get the fulfillment from lifting boxes all day? In North America, I'll use North America, there's about 3.5 million people who are classified as manual material laborers, which is basically they push pallet jacks or they move boxes. That's what they do all day. And another 500,000 who drive forklifts. So 4 million people in North America, that's what they do. And how many of them actually really, really want to do that? I mean, it's non-zero who actually really enjoy it, but there's a lot more fulfillment which is available for people. And then finally, for anyone who's thinking really, really far in the future, this technology does unlock doing the same thing elsewhere, enabling entirely new futures for us. So if I were to close, I would repeat that self-driving cars will not save the world, but their brothers and sisters certainly will. Any questions?
Hesitate to ask technical questions. You can ask ethical questions. This is for you. Get a hand up and a mic runner will bring you a mic. And Ryan, if you can just recognize the people who have a mic first so that we can keep this flowing.
Yeah, a question. So why wouldn't you frame the construction problem as a manufacturing problem?
Mainly because the construction environments, I mean, it's related to manufacturing in the same way that everything is related to each other, that is all materials handling and reordering. But construction is fundamentally in a much harsher environments, less structured environments. You have people who are less trained, like it's a less controlled site in most cases, construction. And then finally, that sort of collaboration isn't really there in most manufacturing environments. Like cars or just manufacturing in general is very, very optimized. So one person does their job as quickly as possible, and then you repeat that 4,000 times, and they all work generally on their own. And then at the end, you get cars and dishwashers and tables and cell phones and things like that. Whereas construction, still by the nature of what you're doing, is that collaboration. And I think we've got a lot more foundation to build before we can quickly solve that collaboration problem, and plus the weather and the training and safety and all that. So, but you're fundamentally, it's related to construction, or it's related to manufacturing, and it's also related to materials transport. Like, that's part of the point, is that they're actually all the same problem when you get down to it. It's just the nuances of your operational environment. I saw other hands.
Here.
Where?
So
there.
the question I have then is, from the standpoint of education, we're not educating our people to work with robotics or fulfillment from that aspect to it. We're teaching them math, we're teaching them languages, we're teaching them about Brazil or whatever the case may be. And I'm just wondering how we kind of, when you talk about fulfillment, I wonder if you have these jobs with robotics, maybe some people like driving a forklift, maybe some people, I'm not sure where the fulfillment is going to come from. And I'm not sure how we're preparing our students of the day for these future occupations.
Yeah, I think, well, that's where you get into the questions of like, what do people do all day, and the general future of work topic in general. I think we're not going to get to a point where you will have no forklift operators whatsoever. Like, I'm actually a trained forklift driver because and some of my team are, because we're building robot forklifts, so I'm actually qualified to do so. But you're still going to have, I think, some forklift drivers, at the very least, to help build these systems. But I think from the future of work perspective, we can provide people a little bit more freedom, where they're driving a forklift because they choose to and they enjoy it, not because if they don't do that for 20 years or 40 years, then their family isn't fed. From an education perspective, I do like to advocate for people to learn economics in general, just because that really drives a lot of these decisions. But I don't think anyone goes through high school and learns forklift driving skills, for example. So I think there's still a lot more exciting topics which can be taught in this field, and not everyone has to be, the roboticist. There's plenty of other interesting areas of development for us to work through, as you'll see through the next few days. But the question is, how do we free those people so they have that choice? I'm going to take a question over here. Oh, sorry, Greg.
Yeah, hi, yeah. Maybe this is a question for the ethics portion of the week. I'm not sure if we have an ethics portion of the week, but I'll ask it anyway.
This is your chance to make sure it's threaded throughout.
Well, it's killing me because I'm typically a capitalist by nature, so every once in a while my human side comes out. So these people that you're going to free as a result of robotics, typically a lot of people just can't ascend or do anything else than what they are typically doing, the dull, the dangerous, and the dirty jobs. By virtue of their lower IQ, or by virtue of maybe a lack of motivation or something. But when you say you free them, you actually unemploy them to do nothing. Have you thought about, is that how does robotics free them to do something else? Or is that, again, this is a question for the ethics side, but what do you mean by freeing them to do something else?
I think the point is to get this degree of freedom into society as a whole. I think societies, not global society, but individual countries, have to make certain decisions on how they're going to choose to move forward. We don't have any of this technology which is deployed at this level right now, but we already have, in certain countries most particularly, massive disparities in power, in wealth, in access to just basic healthcare and education. We already have this problem. By developing this technology, it actually gives countries more degrees of freedom to be able to do this. That they can, what I've put forward there is that if we can find that 1% of costs, then everyone can still get paid because the vehicles are still operating. And I've done the energy calculations too. It's not actually that high either. So it really comes down to that societal impact. What I will say in the short term, that we have never actually, we have hundreds and hundreds of self-driving vehicles in factories in the field right now. No one has ever come to us and said, we want to do this because we want to fire people. No one actually does that, because their problem is that people won't take the jobs now anyway. That the average factory that we deal with has something like 400 jobs open, and they're all really, really awful jobs. So I think there is that question on fulfillment, on do they feel fulfilled? Well, I think we are all very, very fortunate to be sitting in this room and be able to discuss this. And so there are friends of mine who do work manual labor and have worked it for significant periods of time. I'm sure they would love to have that choice. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's enough that there are problems with some societies right now which need to be addressed anyway. This will just help us have better tools.
Hi, I wanted your thoughts on something. So when I worked in China, I remember someone said to me, robotics would never take off here because human labor is so inexpensive. And I'm gonna use that analogy because today I work in banking, and oftentimes when we look at the problem, we look at, we have hundreds of thousands of people in operations doing not dangerous work, but very repetitive work. Yet when we look at the relative investments trade-off, it's often just the economics doesn't make sense. So I guess I'm curious, your thoughts as to what would it take for us to look at automation across all the industries, and what's actually going to take it, get it beyond robots to actually drive a different type of work?
So I know there was a recent study done in Ontario, at least, on the future of work, which covered both manufacturing and finance. And I think there is the risk of boiling the ocean and looking at how will technology apply, how will all technology being developed in the next 100 years apply to all areas of the economy. And I think that's a challenge, that's something which human minds are it's hard to wrap your head around, that entire challenge. I think it's likewise important. I think there's probably a more qualified person than myself to stand up here and talk about the future of AI and knowledge work. I do tend to focus on this because banking and other jobs like it, though repetitive, are still more comfortable and a lot less literally backbreaking than many of these other jobs. And they're also, they're located in more friendly places. There's all sorts of reasons to do it. So I'm biased, I'm of course biased, but then even looking at this, I would take the position that we should focus here as more of a priority. But of course, yeah, knowledge work, it's in general. I think I heard a comment from that table when I came back into the room talking about how there's this lack, banking is going to be digitized, where there's a lack of, where people just want to connect with a platform. And that, of course, reduces the perceived benefit of having a relationship with your banker. But on the other hand, then you do get into the risks of AI not knowing your background and then just, saying, you know what, you were 2 days over on your mortgage payment, I'm foreclosing on you, and automatically auctioning off your house to the highest bidder on the next generation of eBay. Like, this is why we need to make sure that there still is that human touch in any sort of complex system.
From an industry perspective, and as we look at lessons that we've learned, and you talk a lot about what I call a globalization effect, where you've talked through other countries and geographies where we've seen this. And I'm curious, how are you working through what standards might look like? How do we make sure that the robots in Canada would be the same or interact with similar robots, I guess, or robotics in other countries?
Well, I think you have certain things like what I think it was Greg was commenting on, being a capitalist, that we sell internationally, or we're starting to sell internationally. We have every reason to make our robots compatible because it reduces our costs. But that's the capitalist answer, right? That if I'm trying to sell internationally, and any reasonable country company that's starting up right now needs to be an international company, particularly Canadian companies need to start with an international mindset. So that there's that economic force to try to standardize. You also have the economic force with the buyers. So we also sell to multinational companies. They want to standardize because it makes their life easier. They can standardize their training. They can standardize their processes. We do heavy work with both Toyota and Caterpillar, for example, and those are both large multinational companies. They don't, I presume, they don't really want to buy one set of technology in one plant and then buy another set of technology in another plant in another country when those plants are doing the same thing. So the buyers also have incentive in the economic system. But then beyond that, I would put a little bit of a shout out to the robot operating system, which is something that our company has been deeply involved with for 9 or 10 years now, where it is a global community, an open source global community on robotics. And the last 3 locations of the conference it was Vancouver, 3 years ago was Seoul in South Korea, then we had Vancouver, then we had Madrid, and this year coming up is Macau. So we're really trying to make it this global community where I can hire someone from China who knows this operating system or this framework, they can work on my robots and vice versa. So there's also pressures like that. It's not an enforced global standard because those tend to be, we'll just say, inefficiently run, but it just makes sense to do.
You probably have time for 2 more questions. And then I promise we'll keep Ryan around throughout the day so that the rest of you can ask more questions. Yes?
Hi. Is this on? Yeah, there we go. So, Ryan, I just want to ask about 2 particular sectors and wondering how they are driving things. One being military and what you've seen, and also the other one, are we going into more waste management or hazardous waste management controls with robotics?
So military, I mean, for a very long time, military made up the lion's share of robotics research funding. That over the last decade or so has completely inverted, so now it's industry. I know there's at least one gentleman from the military in this room. I would advocate for keeping your costs down to start looking at the robots which are already coming off the shelf and see if they're useful. For instance, the military doesn't entirely buy custom pickup trucks when they're looking to drive around. They might get overcharged for them, but they don't buy them. I think there's a lot of areas there which align with the military. I chose not to put it up there because I try to be driven by the value that they bring, and I don't think it's like there's a clearly defined value. I do believe that militaries are necessary because unfortunately the world is at times a violent place, but I try to stay out of that from an economics benefits perspective. Like from a pure economic standpoint, especially for a country like Canada with our position in the world, it's less about, it doesn't have that continuing impact or that follow-on virtuous cycle afterwards. Whereas like manufacturing, if you make manufacturing more effective, then you are freeing up more people, you're freeing up more resources, but we have a very small military in the first place, so it doesn't actually free a ton of people. And we don't tend to be engaged in conflicts on any scale. But obviously, I mean, it was one of the first places where robotics really got involved, or really got introduced. So there's always going to be a spot for it. And hazardous waste, I think hazardous waste, you get into subsets of these other problems. For instance, certain kinds of hazardous waste, you can make the analogy towards mining. Others, you can make the analogy towards farming or construction. Now, I would just look at the environment that it's in. Like, does it look like a mine? Does it look like a farm? Does it look like a construction site? And I think just like you're manipulating material to put things in, you're also oftentimes trying to remove material out, or vice versa. For instance, our vehicles are sometimes used for what's called for dunnage transport, which is basically clean waste removal, like removal of cardboard boxes or empty skids or things like that from a factory environment. And that's kind of the starting point. And then, but obviously it does further create more of a benefit case because it's just dangerous for people. So the safety benefit gets even more increased. And I mean, there's other areas too. Like nuclear power is a very focused area of robotics research, but it's very focused.
I think we have a mic
over here.
A mic out? Okay, let's take one more
Someone
question.
pick for me.
So I understood
All right, two mics.
the model of the different environments and how that'll affect adoption. But what is the reasoning behind that? Are there specific technological developments that have to occur to be able to break into mining, for example? Or so what are the drivers and the gating for those predictions?
I was trying to click back on this, but do I point it somewhere? I'm frozen. Okay. So generally it comes down to those. Oh, ooh, we'll just keep going. There we go. So it comes down to these basics here, where any of these robots need to navigate safely around people and interact with matter. That's basically, it's the commonality. The question is, in what environments, what kind of people, and how are they interacting? So I start here by looking at what is the simplest environment that still has all of those challenges, and then going from there. So again, this is why we start with manufacturing, because everyone in a plant is generally trained. They're wearing steel-toe boots. We have climate control. The regulations are nice and clean. There's a nice structured environment, ordered tasks. Like all of this stuff has been heavily optimized. Manufacturing is heavily optimized. And then you kind of step by step, what is the next smallest? You look at an extreme case where construction is obviously the most complicated because now all of those things are wrong. And then you kind of fill in the gaps of what is the next smallest step. If you're familiar with the concept of minimum viable product, like how do you build MVPs on top of MVPs? Right? We don't start when you're a web app developer. You don't start by saying, I'm going to start by building an operating system. Like I'm going to start by building the entire internet. But sometimes you get companies who are starting in these higher end areas, and that's effectively what they're doing. They're not waiting for that operating system to get built yet. And by companies, I don't necessarily blame them. I would look as well at the VCs or the government funding agencies or however they're getting funded and saying, like, maybe you shouldn't build the entire, maybe part of your plan for this new video sharing app shouldn't be build the entire internet and make the VC pay for it. Like there's steps which can be taken sooner. And I think if you're pitching someone for funds and they said, and your pitch was, I need to do all of this stuff, then they would probably turn around and tell you to take a simpler problem and not do that. But somehow in the robotics field, you can get away with that. You can get away by saying, I'm just going to build all of this technology.
All right. Final question, table 9, from our futurist. My friend, what do you have?
I was curious about your timelines because people like Ray Kurzweil, he said that I think by 2039 he predicted that there's not going to be a single job that humans can do better than machines, and that by 2045 that's when the singularity is going to happen, when there's no discernible difference between humans and robots. So I'm just curious where, because you said like autonomous construction, for example, is 35 years out. I'm just curious, like, what you would say to Ray Kurzweil or how you came up with your timelines.
So part of this is based on, having spent, 14 years in commercializing robotics in various ways. So part of it is just having observed it. It's a very, very fast-moving field, but it's not entirely about the field. It's also about the environment that you're working within. You can't force people to change. Like you can't, no matter how quickly that government or the technology shows up, you can't retrain everyone working around cars, for example, or retrain governments to rebuild all their regulations like this. Like there's a delay there. The second thing is that I would take the position more on gentlemen like Toby Walsh, who's an AI researcher out of Australia, as well as Rodney Brooks, who was the co-founder of iRobot, and they've both made some fairly, what I believe to be logically sound statements on why this technological singularity, as in machines get smarter and smarter and smarter, and eventually they become like godlike in 30 years, isn't necessarily true. There's a lot of cases. I do believe in exponential growth significantly, not just because if I don't say that, they'll kick me off stage, but more that exponential growth, like there's various forms of exponent, right? And Ray Kurzweil advocates towards like an exponent that does this, and I think many of the other people who have had experience deploying these systems and working with people to get these systems into market know that there is an exponential growth, but it's a smoother curve on the exponent. It's not as sharp. And when I look at, Rodney Brooks has actually done a lot of commenting on this on his blog, and he has actually far more experience than I do and far more history than I do in this matter. And he's built, the outcome of his robots are on other planets. He designed the entire architecture around the Roomba. Like there's a lot of stuff that he's done. And I think we need to look back at the historicals of 10 years. Like it's possible that maybe we are at that knee of that exponential curve, and in the next 10 years it looks like this. But what I would say is that if all we keep doing is pouring our money into the far right problems and problems which don't actually solve value, where does that exponential growth come from? Like there's been, about $250 million in the last year or so poured into social robots, and there's no value there. So how does exponentials need to be self-reinforcing? So if you build someone and nobody cares, does it really reinforce that growth? And right now, like I think if we did decide that this is the way we want to do things, I think we could hit these dates sooner. But I need to look at the current state of the world as well and say that given the way that we do tend to invest in things, and we do like, shiny toys occasionally, that this is where we're going to wind up.
All right. And with that, I will say, Ryan Gariepy, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Ryan Gariepy.